I was about to ask this group if they've ever woken up and found themselves tortured by the question, what makes leech saliva so beneficial? Or why would nature have evolved a creature, a bloodsucker, that has large teeth and uses them to saw into the mucous membranes of mammal orifices, including urethras, rectums, and vaginas? If you're tortured by that question, you want to meet our next speaker, Mark Siddall.
Words and images carry meanings. I want everybody to open their program just to the inside cover. I'm going to hold this up because I know we're live podcasting. Camosutraflage is what came to mind. I'm going to talk about parasites. I'm going to talk about leeches. I'm going to talk about my work at a museum. And I'd like everybody, before I start, to get a thought in your head about what you think a leech is and what you think a museum is, like the Royal Ontario Museum next door here. Okay, now I'm going to try to change your mind. But first, 3 rabbis walk into a museum. No, really. So these gentlemen are from the Orthodox Union, the very largest organization that certifies food as kosher. Now, if you lose your kosher certification as a food provider, for example, you make sardines or you make peanuts or something like that, there's a huge section of the population who will not eat your food. So this is very important. And they showed up at the museum because there was a complaint coming from the community, a concern coming from the community. People were opening up their cans of sardines and finding worms in them. People were opening up containers of fish eggs, capelin eggs, and finding worms in them. Now, the concern wasn't a health concern. It was a concern that someone hadn't prepared the food properly, that worms from the intestines had mixed with the flesh of the fish, and thus meant that the fish was not kosher. And so these individuals were on the task of trying to figure it out. So how do we figure out whether or not these worms are one species or no? It turns out that some species of worms will be in a fish when they're a larval stage and they're running around in the muscle. Other species will be in a fish when they're an adult, which means that they're in the intestines. And so all we needed to do was figure out what the species were, because obviously we couldn't tell in cut up fish or eggs where they had originally been. But if we know the life cycle and we find out the species name, we can do that. How do we do that now? Well, we do stuff like this at the museum all the time. We're not just a bunch of dusty curators sitting in dusty offices looking at dusty critters in dusty jars. I might be a little dusty. But we do the most cutting-edge modern molecular biology in museums in terms of our description and characterization of the biodiversity on this planet. And this is an example. You could take a gene like cytochrome oxidase, sequence it, and it's going to be different for each species. So you can tell what species it is on the basis of a single gene. This is a method that we use. This is actually, believe it or not, that is actually the very first evolutionary tree ever drawn. That's by Charles, that is Charles Darwin. This was drawn by Charles Darwin. You notice that, I think. Turns out he was right in his thinking. So we can take that gene and sequence it. This is a method referred to as DNA barcoding. Indeed, it's sort of like a barcode. This has been promulgated in great ways by someone named Polyethnic at the University of Guelph, for example. The Canadian Barcode of Life initiative is centered there. And if we just had that gene for everything, then we could figure out the sequence and place it in a tree and know what we were dealing with. So I'm in the business of evolutionary trees. I'm in the business of leeches. And indeed, I came here to talk to you about leeches, although I do work on other parasites like these worms that we're talking about. And you'll get the story, how that wrapped up at the end. Your impression of leeches is probably as a medical oddity. You probably think that they were medieval, and it sort of harkens back to a time when medicine didn't know what it was doing before we had germ theory and things like that. Indeed, leeches were used for bloodletting to balance the 4 humors in medicine since going back to Indian traditions. that well predate things like Hippocrates and Galen and so forth in Western tradition. But their popularity actually hit its height, not in the Middle Ages, but in the 1800s, because of this guy, Broussais, who was one of Napoleon's surgeons. Broussais thought that instead of slicing veins open and risking people bleeding to death, we could put leeches on them and people probably wouldn't die, and this would be a better way to blood lead. And it turns out that they probably killed fewer people that way, even though they didn't really heal anybody using leeches. While it has fallen out of favor, you have other impressions of leeches from movies.
Mysterious creatures.
There's anything in the world I hate is leeches. Oh, the filthy little devils.
The last one had 100% rating on Rotten Tomatoes. This one has 2%.
Very sick boy.
Leech! Leeches! Oh my God! Oh my God!
So this probably feeds very well into your personal perception of leeches that I asked you to have in your head at the beginning. I am going to try to change your mind. Leeches are useful. They have modern uses. This is leech oil. You can get this in Indonesia, Malaysia, other places in Southeast Asia. It's used for a particular purpose that I won't describe in detail. Let's just say that there are alternatives. This was supposed to be about sex, right? But in fact, you know, the first human dialysis treatment ever done successfully done without killing anybody by Georg Haas in 1923, and many millions of people rely on this now, was only possible because someone had isolated a compound from leech salivary glands called hirudin. And he was able to line the tubing of where the blood would flow through to create the dialysis treatment by lining it with hirudin, and then the blood wouldn't clot, and you could put it back in somebody after you got rid of the toxins. Leeches were approved by the US Food and Drug Administration in 2005, I believe, as a medical device. And the rationale goes like this. You can actually use leeches to get rid of blood that you don't want. Now, an example here is some gentleman has cut off his finger with an axe, presumably accidentally. When you reattach that with microsurgery, you can reattach the arteries and the blood will flow into the tissue, but the veins you can't actually reattach very well with microsurgery. They'll leak quite a bit. That finger will fill up with blood, and it will clot, and the finger will die unless you get rid of the blood. Well, it turns out putting leeches on will do that. And you put leeches on every couple of hours or every 6 hours, and, 5-hour interval on that one, and it allows the tissue to heal. There's nothing magic about it. There's nothing special in the anticoagulants except that they allow the blood to flow. This is another example. A guy got his ear bit. Have you noticed it's always a guy? Guy had his ear bit off by a dog, and they reattached the ear, and you can see the progress of that healing of the ear with the leeches attached, removing that excess blood and just giving it the time that it needs to heal. So where did my interest in this begin? Algonquin Park. In 1988, I had the opportunity to work on blood parasites of frogs and turtles, and it turned out these are like malaria-like parasites. It turns out they were all vectored by leeches. And I got to see the amazing, incredible diversity of leeches, and I'm going to try to share that with you now. This is a European medicinal leech, and another one. Did you know they were this colorful? Now, setting aside the fact that this Theromyzon species infests the nares of ducks until they suffocate, it is really pretty, right? And this African leech, probably not unlike the one that was feeding on Humphrey Bogart in The African Queen, has a beautiful checkerboard pattern on the back. These are marine leeches. One of these feed on sharks. These feed with beautiful frilly things that we don't even know what they do. You know, there's only like 3 of us in the world who work on leeches. So we don't know everything. These feed on sea turtles. Some of these are also on sharks. The North American medicinal leech has even been featured. Sex. Really, that's what they do. They're hermaphrodites, so they give as good as they get. The North American medicinal leech with these beautiful red polka dots going down the back have actually been part of the Osage Indian creation myth. So they're not maligned everywhere. The way they feed, the medicinal leeches have these 3 jaws that they use to saw into your skin, and they're actually going to drink right down the middle there. The pharynx is in the middle. And so you get this sort of peace sign with a Mercedes-Benz symbol, very prestigious, and of course they inject anticoagulants. They don't do that so that you bleed, they actually do that so they don't turn into a brick and after they finished feeding when your blood clots. That's all out of self-interest. There are also terrestrial leeches. The one that you saw on screen earlier was a terrestrial leech. They actually move this fast. So if you're in Australia, Madagascar, Southeast Asia, Sri Lanka, and so forth, and you're in the humid jungles, this is what is waiting for you. But take a minute and look how pretty they are. I mean, look at that. It's bright orange, and this thing's got a green racing stripe down the back. Conserving charismatic megafauna like dolphins and whales, very easy. But if I can convince you to conserve charismatic microfauna, then I think we're going to be better off, because there's a lot out there that needs your attention, as you've already heard in this session. Now, you'd think that I would be the first one to have this idea, let's conserve leeches because they're cool too. It turns out I'm not. Matt Groening, who I met about a month ago, had the idea first.
I'm going to raise it and care for it so the world will forever know what it's lost. Ah, you freaking slime wad! No, I killed it. It was the last of its kind. Let go of me, you poor thing.
So let me tell you a little bit about what we do in my lab, because right now I've just been trying to entertain you a little bit. We collect leeches, which is really cool because we don't have to go looking for them. They're coming to us, which is kind of cool. You'll notice that in this picture I'm standing this is in Madagascar, and I'm wandering around in a jungle in barefoot and bare legs. This is what we do. To illustrate this more clearly, we're going into a fairly remote area where we have to go by canoe or boat or what have you, and roll up your pant legs, wander in the water, make a little bit of movement while you're doing it, though, because leeches have got a lot of ways to find you. One of those is that the movement you make in the water, they can sense with receptors they've got on, mechanical receptors they've got on your body, and when you're wiggling around like that, from several meters away, they will notice you're there and come swimming, which we should see in just a second. Oh, here we go. Do you know they do that in a perfect sine wave? For any of the physicists out here? And then eventually you'll get them on your legs. We come out of the water. And this is the giant Amazonian leech that we found in French Guiana. Absolutely beautiful specimen. Some of the compounds in its saliva actually have anti-metastatic effects on tumor cells. Now, you're not eyeing now, are you? Now, wherever we go, it's the kids who know where the leeches are. So we do a lot of interacting with people in the field. This was in Rwanda, for example. And we also try to let people know what we're doing. We're not collecting them for food, and we try to get them interested, but they have kind of the same reaction you do. There are some dangers with doing this kind of field work. And I won't go through all of them. I'll just allude to them briefly. This is not Algonquin Park. In fact, do you know that hippos kill more people in Africa than any other vertebrate, than all of the other snakes and crocodiles and so forth combined? Alas, there is a leech that lives on a hippo that I needed for my research, and making it worse is that it lives exclusively in the rectal tissues of the leech. This is an example of it. They have parental care. This thing is holding on to its babies to take to their first blood meal. That's a different kind of awe, right? It's good. So we went looking for this thing in South Africa, and don't let the smile on a hippo's face lull you into submission, because behind that smile is a series of very big and sharp teeth. Now, we were in South Africa. This gentleman who was with us had a rifle, and I asked him, oh, great, so like if a hippo charges at me, you can shoot it and stop it, right? And he goes, I can't kill a hippo with this thing. I've got this in case it bites you and you'll want me to shoot you. This is a hippo leech on a piece of hippo rectum with all of its babies. Now you know why hippos are so ornery. We managed to get that leech. So there are other leeches that will... That was an ah, not an ooh, right? So there are other leeches that feed on mammals. That's interesting, is that this hippo leech feeds exclusively on mammals. You go through the literature and you find cases of, if you haven't figured this out, that's a leech in someone's eye. Okay, hang on, I've got it from another point of view. There. The physician who sent me this, you'll note, so some guy showed up in his office with a leech in his eye and was clearly freaked out, like you would be, right? So what did the doctor do? Went and got his camera first. So if you go through the medical literature, there are lots of cases of this. Here's one coming out of a dog's nose. This is actually an ultrasound of someone's bladder. And we heard of a case yeah, so this is kind of gross. This is going up into someone's nostril. We heard of this case in Peru where someone was finding leeches in kids' noses. And they sent them, this is up in remote areas in Peru, and they sent us some of these specimens to look at. And when we looked at them, it was amazing. Instead of those 3 jaws, they had only 1 jaw. Here you can see he's going to grab it. And pull it out. There you go. Had 1 jaw and 8 enormous teeth. These are the biggest teeth we've ever seen in any jawed leech anywhere in the world. So we gave it an appropriate name, Tyrannobdella rex, so that we could say that T. rex is alive and well feeding on children in the Amazon. Now what was really cool was that from the evolutionary tree we figured out that there's this whole lineage of leeches that have adapted to feed exclusively on mammals, and T. rex is in there. Okay, so what's the big idea? This is a conference about ideas. And we have this idea about what we can do with evolutionary trees in the work that we're doing on leeches. Leeches have all of these different anticoagulant compounds in their salivary glands that people have been characterizing for years and doing very expensive and complicated X-ray crystallography to find out how hirudin, for example, binds with thrombin to prevent it doing its job. We thought, instead of that, if we get the same anticoagulants out of various species of leeches across the evolutionary tree of leeches, instead of looking at a model organism, we could then look and see, taking the RNA, converting it to DNA, making copies of that using reverse transcriptase, and then cloning it and sequencing it all, we could look at what's happened in the evolution of leeches over time. Where did the individual anticoagulants evolve? And more importantly, we could characterize which amino acids in the proteins are critical for functioning. If they're critical for functioning, they won't change in evolutionary time. Evolution has done its own what we call site-directed mutagenesis. What doesn't work doesn't survive. What does work does. Where it can change, we can detect that. Where it can't change, we can do that too. So this is work going on right now, and I think it is a big idea. One more thing. When I was at a conference recently, I ran into Steve Tobolowsky, who's a great character actor. You may know him from Glee or from Deadwood. He was the insurance guy in Groundhog Day. He asked me a question. He says, what is the same everywhere you go? You travel all over the world collecting leeches and doing biology. What's the same everywhere? The answer is that a smile is the same everywhere. We rely so much on our people. This is in Rwanda, war-ravaged Rwanda. Everywhere you go, it's funny, if you give someone a smile, they will always give it back. And with that, I thank you.
Thanks very much. That's great. That's a great time. Good job.
Thank you very much.
For the rabbis, that's good.
Did you like that?
Yeah.
Great rabbi.
Oh! Yeah, I'm sorry. 8 different species of worms. I heard from them just yesterday. Thank you for reminding me. 8 different species of worms. They were all larval stages. They're all worms from the flesh. It may be unsightly. It may be unhealthy. But totally kosher. As for movies that have 100% rating in Rotten Tomatoes, how many of you have seen Atlantic City?
Oh,
You know, there's only one leechy character in that movie.